Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CSBA webinar, Collective Bargaining in Tough Financial Times and Strategies to Help You Come Through the Difficulties of Negotiation with Your School District or County Office of Education in stronger shape, prepared to provide high-quality education and a sustainable district for all students and staff. I appreciate you joining us today. We won't waste any time getting into the webinar, but first, we do want to provide some housekeeping details to make sure that you can participate fully in today's event. So at the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer segment where we will do our best to answer your questions. In order to take part in that event, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to enter your questions. You should see that there are two chat bubbles with Q&A below at the bottom of your screen. There's a ribbon down below the speaker there. You will hit that icon to enter your question in the panel. You don't have to wait until the very end. You can submit your questions during the presentation, and that's actually helpful to us here as it allows us to kind of go through and curate the questions so we can prepare who to present those questions to at the end of the presentations when we reach the Q&A section. And don't worry for those who aren't able to watch the whole webinar, or maybe for your colleagues who aren't able to be here today, they will be able to receive this information before the end of the week. We will email all registrants both the recording as well as a copy of the PowerPoint deck that the panelists are using. So there's opportunity for everybody in your organization that needs this information to get this information. And now the people who will be providing the knowledge today. We begin with John Pearl, an esteemed attorney from DWK, a CSBA legal partner of a long time and great standing, and he will tell more about his organization when we get to his part of the presentation. We also have Matt Phillips from School Services of California. I think you all know them. They've been helping districts throughout the state on various issues related to finance and collective bargaining. We have CSBA's own Kristin Lindgren-Bruzzone, who is our general counsel here today, as well as Joshua Daniels, who is the chief of our policy and governance technology department, as well as a former school board member, general counsel, and other positions at the school district level. I'm Troy Flint. I'm the chief of communications here at CSBA, and I'll be your moderator for today's events. So with that, we will kick it over to Kristin to begin the meaty part of today's presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So great to see so many of you here. So our CEO and executive director really wanted us to put on this webinar, and we're excited to do it because we know there are a lot of new board members out there. There's been quite a bit of turnover on boards in the last couple of elections. And this might be the first time that you have been through a difficult financial period. And we have all kinds of overlapping economic issues that you might not have had to serve under at this time that all have kind of hit at the same time in a bit of a perfect storm. The ending of one-time COVID funds, fiscal cliffs related to enrollment declines, which are affecting many districts in the state. And then sure enough, we are compounding all of that with a huge state budget deficit. The numbers are looking a little bit better, but it's still creating a lot of difficulty in the state, and we may see some budget cuts from that. We will have also a webinar about the May revise when that happens. They'll provide some additional information, and Matt has a lot of great information as well about kind of the state of the economy. But the purpose of this webinar is to give you some basics on collective bargaining agreement. For some of you who are more veteran board members, some of this is going to seem really obvious, but we wanted to give some real basics for anyone who's new, or any administrators who are here that are new. And then we'll talk some specifically about what the board's role is in negotiations, because sometimes that can be sort of a difficult dance to do, to make sure you're providing enough authority to your chief negotiator while still staying engaged and being able to assist them. So we'll talk about that. We'll go through Matt will go through some of the kind of economic picture, and then we'll talk about communications, and then we'll end with some specific strategies around negotiating in new economic or in difficult economic times. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. So just kind of starting with some basics on why we have collective bargaining. Most districts in California have what we call exclusive representatives, or they might be colloquially referred to as unions, that represent both your certificated and classified employees. There are districts that have unrepresented classified employees, and there may be one or two with unrepresented certificated employees, but for the most part, we do see unions in school districts in California. California law, the Educational Employment Relations Act, or also referred to as the ROTA Act, governs the relationship between districts and exclusive representatives in California, and places a lot of obligations on the LEAs to comply with requirements to bargain in good faith over the terms and conditions of employment, among other things. And we're focusing on that bargaining here today. The idea is in that second bullet point, that was to improve management and employer-employee relations by having them come together collectively and reach agreement on the terms and conditions of employment. That is a great goal, but sometimes there is confrontation and not so much collaboration. So, and that often occurs when there is a difficult economic situation, because both sides have less to give. So we're hoping we can help smooth that over by providing this information today. Next slide, please. So under the statute, the list of items on this this list are things that you have to bargain with your unions. They're in the statute. They're enumerated in the specific terms of the statute. Each of these things, if requested, you have to bargain. And if you look at your collective bargaining agreements, you'll see all of these things in them. They've been bargained, but they return to the table for bargaining. Now, would it be nice if this was the full list? There was nothing else. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There is the Public Employment Relations Board is the administrative body that oversees the Educational Employment Relations Act and other labor statutes in California. And they issue decisions that set sort of precedent for how this statute will be implemented based on cases that are brought to them by unions and employers. And they have many years ago set forth a test called the Anaheim test, because it was named after a school district in Anaheim, that allows them to determine whether other terms and conditions of employment are within the duty to bargain, which means that you have to bargain them upon request. And so this list, while in the statute, has been expanded quite a bit, where to the point that most things are subject to the duty to bargain. And, as you know, PERB is appointed. The board is appointed, and so they are a political body. And currently they are pretty worker friendly, pretty union friendly. So they often come down on the side of an employee organization's request to make something subject to the duty to bargain. So just keep in mind that there are other things that you are obligated to bargain over, and that the list keeps expanding.
Hey, Kristin, one thing to add, if that's okay?
Please.
Another really expanding area, which has proved, I think, difficult for districts and public employers, is the whole, what Kristin's talking about as far as the enumerated terms and conditions. That's where decisions have to be negotiated. Before the board can actually make a decision, they have to bargain. Now, that's one part. And then the other part, though, is whether there's a negotiable effect. And a negotiable effect could be a situation where there's managerial prerogative that exists, but the district has to anticipate whether there are negotiable effects. And if that's the case, then before you can move forward, in most cases, there is an exception, but in most cases, you have to give notice to the union in advance before you implement an opportunity to bargain, or at least to request bargaining. And that can really slow down your ability to move forward on some very important initiatives. So there's been a huge proliferation, expansion of the duty to bargain effects that really has been fueled by more recent PERB decisions.
Yeah, really good point. And it comes to the point where there's almost it's almost a distinction without a difference, because you're hampered as much on effects bargaining as you are when you have to bargain the decision. And that is by design, probably. So yeah, thanks, John. Really great point to point out. Let's go to the next slide. So your duty is to bargain in good faith. And the union also has that duty to bargain in good faith. And failure to do so can result in a complaint in front of the Public Employment Relations Board. I'm going to start calling them PERB from here on out. You'll know what I mean. So what does this mean? And we've already had a question about what it means to bargain in good faith. And that means that you come to the table prepared. You have authority to make offers or proposals on items that you are bargaining, that you attempt in good faith to reach agreement and compromise. So that is kind of it in a nutshell. There are some things that PERB has said constitute bad faith. So that includes just a refusal to negotiate, making a change, what we call a unilateral change to the terms and conditions of employment that have been negotiated without any notice or opportunity to bargain that change. Surface bargaining, which is just what it sounds like, which is basically pretending to bargain, coming to the table and saying you're bargaining, but being unwilling to compromise, change your position, effectively engage in those negotiations, that good faith back and forth. And then another example of bad faith bargaining is regressive bargaining. So you come to the table, you make an offer, and then you take it back. So there's some nuance to that, but that's those are the kind of things that we see that are bad faith bargaining. Good faith is really being there and intending to reach an agreement. Now, you may not have what the union needs or is requesting. You may not have the money. You may not have the ability to give the increase or the benefits. But you can come and still meet with them, talk with them, go back and forth, and potentially offer something else, something non-monetary that you think can be a good benefit. Or, there's lots of things that you can do even if you're restricted by your finances. And we'll talk some more about that later. Being unable to give a 20% raise is not bargaining in bad faith, but you just have to be at the table and willing to engage in those conversations and the back and forth. Next slide, please. This is very basic, but I just wanted to, note that the terms and conditions of employment are set forth in a written agreement that is called a collective bargaining agreement. For some reason, cities and counties call them memorandum of understanding, but we call them collective bargaining agreements. And you and your unions are party to that agreement and have to abide by that agreement. Typically, once you have completed negotiation of an agreement, you will have what's called a zipper clause that says we don't have to negotiate over this stuff anymore until the end of the agreement, which is 3 years from when you sign off on it. And that's nice because then you and the union know what the terms and conditions of employment are, and you can plan because you know what's there. Now, keep in mind, there may be other subjects that come up, particularly what John was talking about, which is the effects of a policy you may adopt. There are other things that may come up outside of the agreement that you have to bargain during that 3-year period, but what is in the agreement is set forth for 3 years. And then typically agreements also have annual reopener clauses, which allows the parties, if they would like, to reopen negotiations on very specific things. What I have typically seen is it's compensation and health benefits that we see in those reopeners. John, are you seeing anything else in reopeners?
Well, I wouldn't on reopeners. It's usually total compensation plus maybe 1 or 2 additional articles that either side can open up. But I wouldn't be surprised as we head into tough times if we start seeing fewer and fewer 3-year agreements. And actually, where both sides might just be interested in a 1-year agreement, we wait and see what's going to happen economically so that we have full flexibility to open certain articles if that's what the district or the union chooses to do.
Yeah, great point. And that is something that you can ask for as part of your proposals. is to include the length of the agreement as part of what you negotiate. So thanks for that, John. I see we have a lot of questions, but I think we could maybe take some of them at the end of this section. Let's see. Next slide, please. So what happens if you can't agree? You've come to the table in good faith, you've gone back and forth, you've had multiple, and by you, I mean your chief negotiator has had multiple negotiation sessions. Everybody's doing their best, but you cannot reach agreement. That is what we call impasse, which is pretty self-explanatory term, right? We are at an impasse, we cannot go any farther. And so when that happens, you have to go through the statutory impasse process. And the way that that is determined statutorily is that is a point during negotiations where the difference in your positions are so substantial or prolonged that it would be futile to meet again. You just cannot get anything else done. And that's a pretty high standard. And you do have to request that PERB declare impasse, and you have to show that you are at that point, that future meetings will be futile because you are so different in your positions. But once you get there, and PERB does declare impasse, there's a process that can be helpful, but that will ultimately get you through the end of your negotiation. So next slide, please. So this is the process. You have to participate in this process. And we're going to talk later on in the presentation about how this process can actually be really helpful in getting to a solution. But you start with mediation. A neutral mediator will come in and meet with the parties and try to get to a solution. They'll meet with the parties multiple times, depending on how things are going. And if they determine that the parties cannot reach agreement, they will certify to fact finding. And fact finding is a panel of a chair and then a person selected by the district and a person selected by the employee organization. And Matt is going to take you through kind of what the fact finders look for and what that process looks like. So I won't belabor it too much, but it is the parties present their sides. There's a number of factors that they have to meet, and the fact finders can determine what the agreement should be between the parties. There may be some post fact finding negotiation where the parties go back to the table and try to reach an agreement. And then you could go to impasse again. Ultimately, the LEA can implement their last, best, and final offer after they have gone through all of their fact-finding processes, but you have to complete everything, and then you can impose that last, best, and final offer. I would say, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, that typically there's an agreement that's reached. I've rarely had clients actually impose their last, best, and final offer unilaterally. Typically we reach agreement. I don't know, John, if you're seeing different things out there.
No, I think that's generally the rule. I think that's the way the whole statutory construct is set up, to have all these different steps and procedures for the parties to go through to prevent either a strike or unilateral imposition of a last, best, final offer. But we have seen some pretty significant strikes and strike actions lately, which we'll get into more detail. But usually it is worked out.
Yeah, and because I think the employer doesn't want to just unilaterally implement their offer. Everybody wants to have agreed to the terms and conditions of employment. So I think there's a lot of incentive to get an agreement. And speaking of strikes, the last bullet point is concerted activities, which includes strikes. We can go on to the next slide. We also don't want strikes. An agreement avoids strikes. But as where the impasse procedures have been completed and the employer implements their last, best, and final offer, the union can strike.
I think Matt wanted in on.
Oh, go for it, Matt.
Sorry, Kristin, you were on a roll. I didn't want to cut you off.
You're good.
Just kind of on that last slide, as folks are looking at those different steps in the process, At no point does that resolve either party from coming to a tentative agreement. So whether you're in mediation, fact finding, post fact finding, implementing your last, best, and final, and or concerted activities, nothing ends negotiations until you get to a tentative agreement. So I don't want anyone to think that, oh, well, once we get through fact finding, we'll just go ahead and implement our last, best, and final. And the association, if they strike, oh, well, and then we're done. No, you still have to come back to the table and negotiate. We say that negotiations is like marriage without the possibility of divorce. You're going to continue to see each other year after year, and you always need to come back to the TA. And the way that the government code is set up, which Kristin just walked you through, is each step is another tool in the toolbox to allow the employer and the association to try and get to a TA. At no point during this process will an outside third party come in and mandate that either side do something. There's no arbitration, including in negotiations in this impasse process. Each step is a tool to help you get to that TA.
Matt, you do a lot of fact findings. Don't you find that, like, when you actually go to the fact finding quote unquote hearing itself, what's your experience like? How at the beginning isn't a significant chunk of time devoted to actual, like, sort of settlement negotiations where the neutrals and the panel members are trying to work with both teams to work it out?
Yeah, so to kind of backing up, the whole point of the mediator coming in is it's a third party to try and help unstick both of the sides. When you get to fact finding, now you have 3 independent people coming in to help try and settle the deal. The fact finding itself is a little bit of a misnomer. There's no new information that's presented at a fact finding. It's a lot of the same information that both parties have been sharing with each other. It is a little bit more structured of a process, and I'll walk through some of the criteria later on about what a fact-finding panel shall consider and share with you some things that, I think as an organization, whether it's the LEA or the association, some data that you should have at your fingertips. We say at school services, if you prepare as if you're going to fact-finding before that first negotiation session, you're much more likely to be successful in getting a TA at the local level without getting into that impasse process.
Great advice. Thank you, Matt. So strikes. So this is, interesting. I have been practicing in education law and representing districts for a long time. I've been practicing for about 19 years, both at CSBA and with private firms where I represented districts. And I did not see strikes until maybe 5 to 7 years ago. Typically, like I said, my clients and the unions would, even if they got to impasse, went all the way through fact finding after mediation, they would reach an agreement. And, folks don't want to strike, but we're seeing more and more strike activity. So strikes should not be done until after the completion of impasse procedures, but once they have been completed, they can strike. The other thing to keep in mind is something that we're seeing more often is that there is another way for an employee organization to justify a strike based on claiming it's been provoked by the employer's commission of an unfair labor practice. And that could be anything. Interference with the participation in unions by employees, a unilateral change like we talked about before. And in order to justify that, the union doesn't need to show that for sure that the unfair practice actually happened, only if true, the facts that they've alleged would constitute an unfair practice. So that gives a lot more room for strikes, and we're seeing a lot more threats of strikes and actual strikes on this basis, even before the completion of impasse procedures, which, as you can imagine, and based on what Matt was saying about kind of how you have to maintain this relationship, it is very hard to reach agreement if that is what's happening. But it is a tool that employee organizations may use to try to push their proposals and get agreement. Josh, I know your camera's off. I don't know if you want to add anything. You've been through some of this before.
Thank you, Kristin. Yeah, I'll just add that this is sort of an evolving area, sort of, what would it mean to provoke, how serious, the traditional understanding was that, outside or even in the school context, if, let's just say that, heaven forbid, there's an earthquake and a district demanded that employees go back to work in unsafe buildings. That would be a provocation by the employer that would justify the employees striking. And I think we all understand the rationale behind that it's unsafe. So it's typically sort of health and safety provocations that would, necessitate a strike to sort of demonstrate the concern that, the union had. And to wait for impasse and, all that sort of stuff is just too long. But as Kristin alluded to, the practice has gone beyond that. And I think we're sort of seeing, it's unclear how far it can go. Some relationships are such that, that going to a strike sort of might make more sense from the union's perspective, and therefore they might sort of look to this option more likely than others. In other organizations, it's going to be the more traditional thing where no one really thinks of a strike until you go through the, fact-finding, impasse, et cetera process. But it is something to be aware of. And certainly my guess is for some attendees on the call, on the webinar, this is something that they may see down the line.
Great, thank you. All right, John, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the board's role in negotiation. If you want to next slide, please, Che.
Happy to do so. So again, my name is John Pearl. I'm an attorney, a partner at Dannis, Woliver, Kelley. I'm coming to you from San Diego, which is where one of our offices is, and really happy to be a part of the panel and the webinar. So let's talk, this is CSBA. Let's talk about the board's role in negotiations. And I actually think that first bullet is a big deal. To acknowledge and understand the nature of the forum, that the board is actually sharing its authority, sharing its power with this team. A team probably that's selected for the most part by the superintendent, by the assistant superintendent. That team will most likely include the chief business official, the assistant sup, or a director from HR or more, depending, classified, certificated, maybe even some principals who have practical experience, would know how the contract is operating when actually those words get implemented, and have a lot of practical insights. But the board is sharing its authority, which is a big deal, because board members view themselves, I think, as being leaders, as being doers and getting things done. And they're very much in wanting to be participatory. And this is really an exercise in delegation, again, where they're sharing that authority. So I really think that it's incumbent upon the team and of the board to make sure that the board understands and the team understands what the board stands for. What is the board's philosophy for employer-employee relations? What are the goals that the board has for this particular round of negotiations? What are their priorities? Are there certain things that the board is a bottom line for the board, as far as a commitment to maintaining a certain level of reserve, maintaining certain key programs and investments that the board has made in recent histories and sees as being really fundamental for the future? Your team needs to know that. And so there needs to be this interaction with, obviously, the superintendent being the key, the linchpin for that, the superintendent who has the closest relationship with the board, superintendent who has then the closest relationship with the team, for them to be sharing that information with each other, getting to know each other, where when a team that I'm serving on as a member, as either a chief negotiator or an attorney on the team, I want to have a good understanding before I step foot in that negotiations room for the first session, what the board actually stands for. And so if I know that, then the board has actually invested authority in my team. If we haven't done that prep up front, and we are not aware of what the board stands for, what certain key principles are for the board, then it's difficult for us to go beyond the mere just passing of a proposal. So we have to know what our authority is. We have to know what the board will like. And really what we're looking for from the board, that last bullet, is where the board's providing parameters, not a strategy as to how to get the bargaining done and how to get agreement, That's usually what I'm hired for. That's usually what the chief negotiator and the superintendent are focused on. And we're not actually looking for the board to write the proposal. But in order to make a good proposal and to know that we're standing for what the board stands for, we have to have that investment of time to get to know each other. Next slide, please. So really, again, what the board does is they're setting standards for the team. The board should be keenly interested in how our proposals actually affect children. Do the proposals that we're making and our responses to union proposals, do they actually enhance, do they improve teaching conditions? All of those kinds of things will, what we're doing at the table, improve the overall operation and the ability for us to say that this is helping students succeed. If it threatens the maintenance of educational programs, or it's causing detrimental impacts to the budget, then we haven't set the right standards. And I really see a key role for the board up front, weeks before bargaining ever starts, to set those parameters for the team. Next slide. Another key function for the board is to have discipline. Discipline as a collective, as far as the board itself, but also discipline as far as individual board members are concerned. A phrase that we use often is we need to avoid direct dealing. We need to avoid situations where we have one board member who believes that and has good, pure intentions that they can help the process along, and they've created a pipeline for themselves to have communications and conversations directly with union leadership. That is problematic because, number one, the bargaining team's not privy to what those direct dealing situations are between board members and union leadership. But also the bargaining team and also the board itself aren't privy to that. And that can very much so undermine the leadership team's ability, the bargaining team's ability to get things done. There's an important exception that allows for the board, if it feels like it needs to regroup with the team, if it needs to provide additional direction. There is an exemption that exists in the Educational Employment Relations Act, or the RADA Act, as Kristin referred to it earlier. It allows for the board to provide directions to its team for negotiations with represented employee groups, not unrepresented employees, but it's an exception to the Brown Act, and those meetings can happen at any time, anywhere, by phone, by conference call, in a meeting room, and the requirements of the Brown Act as far as, notification for a meeting and agendizing an item, those do not apply. But it is limited to when the board's providing directions to its team. And it's also limited to where we are talking about negotiations with represented employee groups, a CTA association, a CSEA, SEIU, Teamsters Association, where it's a represented group. That's where you have that exception, which allows the board to collaborate more and avoid negotiating or speaking about negotiations issues in public. Next slide. We'll talk more about communications later.
John, can I tack on to that real quick, please?
Of course.
Thank you, sir. We wouldn't want to get into the habit of using that exclusion from the RADA Act every time there's a negotiation session. Where I see this most effective is if the management team and the association, they're on the precipice of an agreement, and we want to bring the board along because we want to do something maybe a little bit differently. That's really where I see that being used. Also, if an LEA goes all the way to fact finding, rather than waiting for the next board meeting to get an update for the board or look for additional authority, we'll convene the board members, give them an update on the date of the fact-finding hearing. And again, we don't have to agendize, don't have to notify. It's a really nice tool to have.
And sometimes, go ahead, Josh.
So I'll just to add on what Matt's saying, I think it provides some comfort to boards to know that they don't have to be as worried about the Brown Act, in the purposes of negotiations. But as Matt said, if imagine yourself as a union leader, right? And one of your tools is to speak to the board before they go into closed session because you know as a union leader that board members are only hearing from their representatives, right, from their lead negotiators. And so, and they're not supposed to, as union leaders, email you directly and talk to you directly. So public comment before a closed session is that time for a union leader to sort of make that statement, the things they want you to know. And so if you continually use this exception to the Brown Act, you're depriving, them of that opportunity and potentially creating some harder feelings, but, and sort of further undermining an already challenged relationship. And so while it's there, definitely something that, should be used sort of with discretion, and only when you really need to. But if you know it's happening in advance, might as well, for the sake of transparency, notice it and agendize it. You're still talking about it in closed session, but at least that way you're doing it in a way that is sort of properly transparent. So I just wanted to, add that.
And thank you. The really important qualifications you're adding. Also, it is important strategically for conference with labor negotiators to show up on that agenda so that the community and the unions do see that the board cares about those issues and that they're discussing it. So yes, it is an exception. I think as both Matt and Josh shared, it is the more typical practice to have it on the agenda and to meet in closed session, but sometimes you need to have it. And I don't think it's necessarily just when you're at impasse or you can't wait. There is that opportunity. I would not do it at a restaurant, or I wouldn't do it publicly because people are going to think, why is the board meeting, even though we have this exception? But it is perfectly legal for the board, for the superintendent to set up a conference call with the board and a chief negotiator and to either discuss negotiations or additional direction that needs to be provided. But wise counsel from both Josh and Matt to be strategic as far as how you use that important exception. All right, as far as the team reflecting the board, I think I talked about this before and I'll leave it at this, but obviously the superintendent is key. The key communicator between the board, administration, and team. They're going to have their finger on the pulse as to what's happening and how to best direct the team as to what's important to the board. And I think also then the superintendent can share with the team what the board's thinking and vice versa. Putting together your team, the board should be mindful of seeing that there are people on that team that hopefully employees have a lot of respect for and see as being problem solvers, and people that are knowledgeable and experienced who can help. And they're not all necessarily on that team because they're going to be the spokespeople at the table. Some of the most valuable things that occur in negotiations with the teams that I'm a part of are during caucuses, where we hear from our team members on the bargaining team, talking about how a particular proposal from the union will impact students, how it will impact operations, and getting their insights. And that helps us to really shape a very positive and helpful response. Next slide, please. Again, I just want to hit this point one more time. As far as the board and spending time with its team up front, again, it's not an issue of the board coming up with the proposals, drafting the proposals, giving direction here, bring this proposal to your next session. It really is setting parameters, giving ideas as to what desired outcomes possibly are, so that you are providing authority to that team to be creative, to be quick on their feet, to be able to consider a host of different options. That's the best way that a board can help the bargaining team. But if it's bottom line direction or micromanagement, then it becomes less and less effective, and it really undermines the ability of that team to do what it needs to do.
Hey, John, we have two people asked the same question. I thought it might be good to answer it here just really quickly.
Sure.
Is it appropriate for the negotiations team to share actual proposals with the board?
Oh, absolutely. It is, and as part of, some districts actually communicate and do a write-up as to what happened in the session, and they'll share that with the board, or it'll go out with the superintendent, or it'll be shared in a closed session. So if it's something that happened during negotiation and a proposal was shared, then that can definitely be provided to the board. And we're going to talk about communication strategies, where sometimes the district team will share publicly on the website or whatever it wants to do a proposal that was shared during negotiations, and sometimes it's even broader than just to the board.
Great, thanks. We do have a couple more questions. I think I'll see if we can answer them just really quickly before we move on to Matt's section. Going back to sort of the beginning, the question is, can a union negotiate the master schedule? And this is a really nuanced question. The students' schedules are not typically negotiable, except to the extent that they affect the schedules of the employees.
You mean the calendar?
Yeah.
True.
That's the calendar. You're right. The master schedule is a little different. I believe that is within the district's discretion, the master schedule.
Yeah, the master schedule is within the district's discretion as the decisions it will make, but there are all kinds of provisions, whether it's prep time, planning time, PLC, starting, ending times, all the different things that are negotiable. So I'm not suggesting that the master schedule be negotiated at the bargaining table, but obviously the principals and administrators responsible for putting that master schedule together. And obviously that is a huge undertaking year after year. They have to be mindful and sophisticated as to what the contract requires when they're making those decisions.
Yeah, and I think one way to look at it is, does what we are proposing have impacts and effects that are that meet the negotiable scope of negotiation with our employees? Because it may seem like it's just a policy decision that impacts only students, but there may be impacts and effects on both certificated and classified staff. So always keep that in mind.
The other big article that's impacted with the master schedule is class size.
Yep.
You know, whether it's elementary for class size or it's secondary, we see student contacts as the verbiage that's used. You know, we want to make sure that in addition to the prep time that John talked about, that we're not violating any class size agreements that are in the collective bargaining agreement.
Right. But there's an old cliche. We don't, what is it? We don't need permission to follow the contract. So if we're faithful to what the contract provides, I'm not saying, hey, we're putting together the master schedule, which is managerial prerogative. But if you want to bargain, I'm not advocating for that. It's really being mindful of all of those relevant articles in the contract that impact how you put together a master schedule. Excellent
point. So moving on, so this question was asked in two different questions, so I'm going to just put it together. What is the action that can be taken when good faith bargaining is consistently violated? Can you then refuse to continue to bargain and move to mediation? And the example given is the other side comes to a second meeting unprepared and is told they're not prepared. Can you declare impasse at that point?
Well, Matt, you want to take a first shot, or you want me to? What's your you call on one of us, Kristin?
Let's go with Matt.
Good.
All right, I'll give you the non-legal advice, and then John will correct me. So this is a good order of operations
Awesome.
here.
Now it's getting fun.
You know, but by the time you get, let me say it this way: districts should not be in a rush to get to impasse. The best deals always happen locally, where it's just the management team and the association team, because you know your LEAs best. So I would never be in a rush to get to impasse. That being said, if, I think Kristin said it really well early on, if both parties are firmly entrenched in their positions and it's very clear that there's no progress that's going to be made and it would just be a waste of time to come back together, that's really where you would want to consider going into impasse and reaching out to PERB. Regardless of which party reaches out to PERB to request impasse and getting into that first phase of mediation, PERB is going to check with the other party to see if they concur. So if the management team reaches out to PERB, PERB will reach out to the association to say, hey, we got this notification from management that says that you're stuck. Do you agree? If the association says we disagree, then PERB will kick it back. They'll say, go back, have another session, try again. And once you both agree that it's time for impasse, then we'll release you to mediation.
Yeah, both sides of the table or both parties, the union and the district, are obligated to bargain in good faith. So if one team or the other is canceling sessions, saying, oh, we're not available until 6 months later, or they show up unprepared, don't have any written proposals, aren't prepared to deal with the issues that have been sunshine as part of the initial proposals, then the union or the district doesn't have the right to declare impasse. The district has the right to file, as Kristin and Matt underscored, they have the right to file, make an impasse request. And sometimes that is a basis for saying, hey, further negotiations with the union, further negotiations with the district would be futile. And that's why one party is actually filing for impasse, and then it's up to the PERB regional attorney to decide and to make that declaration as to whether the parties are actually at impasse. The other thing is, the parties do have a right, and this is what's been happening in some of the more recent strikes or concerted activity issues that have been happening, where one team or the other, one side or the other, will actually file an unfair practice charge with PERB, laying out all of these allegations of bad faith. They're not prepared. They're canceling sessions. They're refusing to negotiate, and PERB on their schedule will determine when they take those complaints up to consider them. But that's another tool in the toolbox that the district has is to file an unfair practice charge.
Great, thanks. I'm going to do a couple more and then I'm going to move on. It doesn't mean we won't answer a question if it's in here. I just want to make sure that we're managing time appropriately. Question, how's the mediator selected and who pays for the costs associated with mediation and fact-finding? I can take this one. PERB selects the mediator through state conciliation and mediation services, and they actually pay for the mediator. They also pay for the chair of the fact-finding panel. So that's great news. There are other labor statutes where the parties have to pay. So under the EERA, PERB will pay. And I believe you have to pay for your own member of the fact-finding panel. If anyone disagrees, go ahead.
The one caveat I would add on to that, Kristin, is once you get to the fact-finding phase, if the two parties jointly select the neutral, then the parties are responsible for the cost of the neutral. If PERB appoints the neutral, then PERB carries the full freight of the cost for that neutral, but 100% right otherwise.
And I'll say this quietly, but I don't think this is too controversial. Some mediators are better than others. And even at the mediation stage, if you can make a request, you do have that ability to work with the union and say, hey, we would love mediator A to help us. Maybe they helped us before. And sometimes the regional attorney, if the mediator is available, will work that out. And I've seen that strategy or that approach work for the benefit of both parties, where they pick a mutually agreeable mediator.
Okay, great. So let's move on to the next section and we'll hear from Matt.
Awesome. And then could I grab a question, Kristin, that I saw in here? There was a couple of them that popped up.
Go for it.
Asking about board members sitting at the table. So I will say this, if you're in an LEA and you have a board member that sits at the bargaining table, usually it's a much smaller LEA, or more rural. I'd say if it's working, then I wouldn't undo what is working. If this is a new thing that you are considering locally, I would say just be thoughtful about what the role of the board member is in sitting at the table, because regardless of the LEA, the board has to have consensus on approving or ratifying any tentative agreement. And once you take a board member whose responsibility is ultimately to ratify an agreement and you put them at the bargaining table, the focus is largely going to shift to that board member in those conversations. So if you are a board member that's sitting at the bargaining table, you kind of need to take off your board hat and put on, hey, I'm the bargaining team member now, and I'm acting on behalf at the direction of the board with the support of the CBO or the superintendent. You're really no longer a board member if you're on the bargaining team in that capacity, right? You don't want to be, I guess the way that I would say it is that because you have that ultimate ratification responsibility, you don't want to carry all the water for the bargaining team. It's a team effort going in. So I would just throw that out there.
And be careful when a board member is assigned to the bargaining team. It does change the dynamic entirely of bargaining, sometimes for the better. I have to recognize that. But typically what happens is all the focus becomes on that one board member who in most cases is an observer, not a real participant on the team. Everything's geared to get their reaction, their focus, their attention. And sometimes that detracts from the ability of both teams to get negotiations done.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the current economic environment, what we're seeing out there. And at school services, we've talked a lot about bargaining at the table and the impasse process. We are not as well versed as John at sitting at the table. That's where John lives his life. Where we come in at school services is if an LEA gets to the impasse process, either mediation or fact finding, that's really where we kind of take the reins. We provide support for LEAs in preparing for fact finding, putting together the materials, and so forth. And so I'm going to be talking to you through that lens. When we think about the number of LEAs statewide, almost 1,000 school districts, 1,400 charter schools, another 58 county offices. And if each one of those LEAs has 2 represented units, we're looking at almost 5,000 individual collective bargaining agreements. The majority of collective bargaining agreements are settled at the table, about 90%. So my lens is really on kind of the 10% and some of the things that we're seeing. So I just wanted to put that caveat out there as we kind of run through this section of the presentation. I will say, just big picture, this is definitely a turning point as far as school finance goes. I've been in school finance for almost 20 years now. And going back to the beginning of the local control funding formula, the implementation of that. So we're coming off the heels of the Great Recession in the 12-13 year into the 13-14 year. The governing law that provides funding for schools in the state of California, Proposition 98, that funding level in 12-13 was just over $47 billion. And if we look at where we are now, we hit the high water mark in 21-22. But depending on what data point you're looking at, whether it's the governor's projections or the legislative analyst's office projections, we're right around the $100 billion mark in annual funding for schools. And so more than 100% increase over this 12-year span, with the bulk of that increase happening from 1920 through 21-22 over a 2-year period. So we're in a very I would say pivotal, for lack of using that word or overusing that word. It is a very pivotal time right now, and we're seeing that at the bargaining table. So let's go to the next slide. Coming off of the 22-23 year, really the message that we were seeing, local units that, again, were not able to settle at the table, that were headed into impasse, was this message of COLA or strike. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about COLA later on and really what that means. But what we hear from the state, which is an absolutely true statement, is that the state is funding COLA. Okay. And so how that translates down to the local level is that a COLA from the state doesn't necessarily equal COLA at the local level. And so as we talk about things that we think are important to prepare for going into the first session, as if you're going to fact finding, this recognition of what COLA is locally for LEAs and what that really translates to into new dollars. Really, really important topic. Next slide. In addition to, money is always an issue, right? I think as John mentioned, whenever we see a collective bargaining agreement or association of management that are bargaining with each other, money, other than 2021, where it was all about MOUs and safety and reopening, money is generally one of the underlying factors, either in bargaining or once a team gets into impasse, either salary or health and welfare benefits, or both, right? We always want to talk about those two in unison as total compensation. Where I find folks start to get in trouble is if they just focus on one versus the other, right? If the focus of the conversation is just salary, and that generally means that the health and welfare benefits look pretty good, and so the focus is on salary. But certainly as a board, you want to have a good understanding of how the employees are compensated overall. I just want to switch away from money real quick, because even in 22-23, even into 23-24, we are seeing some other issues that are creeping into the bargaining world. Depending on your perspective, you might say, well, that doesn't really seem like a working condition type thing. And I would tend to agree with you on that. There's a number of social justice issues that are creeping in. We saw some of these things occurring in Oakland, certainly in LA Unified, where LA Unified was one of the districts that was subject to the unfair labor practice strike. That was the SEIU group that went out last year. But you can see the range of issues that are out there. They're all over the board, but generally money is an underlying component. So, Kent Field, that was a classified group. They were looking for an increase of 14 to 27%, single year increase. West Contra Costa down on the bottom right, they almost went to fact finding last year. They were real close again this year, and they just settled. So they staved off fact finding and were able to settle in the mediation process. Next slide, please. In addition to money, which is generally there, I would say there's also local issues, right? And as a board, understanding those local issues, making sure that your bargaining team understands the local issues. Sometimes I'm not going to say it's more important than the money, but it is significant towards getting a settlement, right? So 3 examples that I have here from LEAs that went into fact finding over the last year and a half. The first one, there's more than 80 issues on the table. And one of the major sticking points had nothing to do with the money. It had to do with what is going to be the district's response to addressing student homelessness. Again, one of those issues, it's not a working condition thing, but it was a very high priority for the association, and they wanted to work collaboratively with the district over this issue and didn't want it to be swept to the side. The next 2 were much more specific to the employees that were on the bargaining team. It was their own kind of personal situations that were impacting bargaining. The first one, the second item on here, this district had about 600 teachers in its bargaining unit. And the final sticking point before getting to a tentative agreement was that 8 of the 600 members had this extra duty component that was in the collective bargaining agreement, and the teachers would not take anything back to a vote until that issue was addressed. One of the bargaining unit members, his wife was one of these 8 members who had to work the extra hours. So again, that local issue that was really important to the bargaining team. The third one, an employee was trying to convert some of their professional development hours that the district paid for into unit movements on the salary schedule, or column movements on the salary schedule. So very robust discussion on the second and third item, and ultimately we were able to come to resolution over that. But the settlement never would have happened had those issues not been clarified. So those local issues are important, as well as the state issues. Next slide, please. So when we think about bargaining, a lot of us will say, especially as a board member, I think it's important to remember what John's recommendation was. As the board, you're setting the parameters, you're setting the direction, and then you're trusting the team to implement the direction that you set, to come up with the strategy for implementing that direction. The quickest way to a settlement, in my opinion, is to have a unified board, right? Recognizing that as board members, you are elected officials, you represent your constituents. That's why closed session is there, where you can, talk about things, debate things, dispute. Certainly, if you want to come out in open session and make a statement, you have every right to. But the quickest way through is a unified board, whether it's a 3-0, a 5-0, a 7-0. And that unification is that we support our management team in pushing this across the finish line. Once you start to kind of carve off one at a time, it makes things more difficult. As a board member, something that I think would be important for you to see, because this is something that would be considered if you go all the way to fact finding, is looking at, well, have we maintained the purchasing power of our employees? And there's a lot of focus on, well, what can the budget afford? What can we do without making cuts to programs? That's all well and good. That's very important information to have. But sometimes the budget can't be the final end all, because the budget just assumes that we're maintaining status quo, right? We're taking the revenues that we think we're going to get from the state, we're adding in all the new costs that are happening in the future, and we're saying this is what our financial picture looks like. This particular table here, again, this is something that's required to be looked at in fact finding, is comparing what has the COLA been from the state over the last 10, 11 years, what has CPI been statewide over the last 10 to 11 years, and then what do our compensation increases look like over the last 10 to 11 years, Okay, we're looking at ongoing salary increases, plus any increases that the LEA is paying for health and welfare benefit premiums. It's a rare instance where an LEA has not been able to illustrate that compensation increases have outpaced both COLA and CPI. Why that's important is because, you know, CPI is really a hot button issue, right? Inflation, it's a hot button issue. It's real. It is present. What we don't want to do is get wrapped around the axle on a CPI point from, you know, let's say November of 2022 as, hey, we've got to meet this with a compensation increase, right? It's about looking at this data over a longitudinal period to ensure that we are maintaining the purchasing power of our employees. Okay, next slide, please. So this notion of COLA, you know, as a company, we have an opportunity to participate in the CSBA trainings through the New Board Members Institute, as well as the Masters in Governance. We do take the lead on the finance module for the New Board Members Institute, as well as the finance and negotiations module in the Masters in Governance. And this is a talking point that I generally see a couple eyes pop open when we talk about this notion of COLA. Right? What does it mean to receive COLA? A cost of living adjustment is just an increase in the funding per student year over year. Okay, so if the state provided $1 per student last year and we get an 8% COLA, now they're going to provide $1.08 per student. Okay, it's an increase in the funding per student. Many LEAs in the state of California are experiencing declining enrollment, right? Declining enrollment, declining attendance. Right? As enrollment declines, attendance is a derivative of that. So both are going to go down. Currently, we are funded on attendance. Right? There's been some bills introduced. Senator Portantino has been the one that's really been pushing the change to enrollment-based funding. But for now, we're funded on students showing up each and every day. Well, if there's fewer students that a district is educating year over year, but there's a COLA, if there's an 8% COLA, but we have 3% fewer students, what we're really looking at is a net COLA or a 5% increase in revenues, right? Funding per student up 8, number of students down 3. I know I don't add and subtract percentages, but we're going to do that for this illustrative purpose here. You have effectively a net COLA, your funded COLA, okay? And it's really important that as a bargaining team, that the bargaining team has their arms around what the funded COLA is, that the bargaining team is communicating that with the board members as well. So the board members are educated on this talking point. This example here is from a district that we're preparing for a fact finding coming up in a couple of weeks. If you look at the 23-24 column, and we look at the change in LCFF revenues, so that's our primary funding source. That's where COLA, when the governor says he's applying a COLA, this is where the majority of that COLA impacts LEAs. You know, the revenues went up $6.4 million, right? Almost 8%. But when you look at the components of that, for this particular LEA, they are declining enrollment, declining ADA. Much of that increase was dollars that are targeted to increase or improve students or increase or improve services for the neediest students in the LEA, our unduplicated pupils. So once we peel back the layers of the onion for this particular LEA, there are ongoing revenues that could be used for any educational purpose, including compensation increases, only grew 3.61%. All right, so even though the state provided a COLA of 8.22%, the real dollars available for a compensation increase only grew 3.61%. Okay, it can be easy to get lost in the details of this. There's a lot of moving pieces that go into the LCFF revenues, COLA, unduplicated pupil percent, average daily attendance. Let your management team handle all the details, right? But having this high level analysis, this high level talking point, I think is really good to have going into that first negotiation session, right? What is our real revenue growth? When we go into 24-25 for several months, the governor had projected that the COLA was going to be 0.76%. We just got the final numbers middle of this last week, April 25th. So we know the statutory COLA for 24-25 is 1.07%. For this particular LEA, it's still going to result in a revenue decrease year over year because, again, declining enrollment, declining ADA. Even though there's a statutory COLA is likely to be funded, this particular LEA is going to see an actual decrease in revenues. Okay, so contextualizing what COLA means is really important. Next slide, please. All right, so just kind of transitioning here from kind of the state funding, contextualizing raises over the last 11 years, contextualizing growth in LCFF revenues, which that's going to be the primary funding source for any compensation increase. I want to talk real briefly about the one-time funds. We're getting to a point now where, from 2021 through really 22, 23, significant investment in one-time dollars in LEAs. A significant portion from the federal government in 2021 and 21, 22. The state then came along, had some in 21, 22, a lot more in 22, 23. When I talk about this being a pivotal time for LEAs, this to me is probably the most important component, is how are LEAs spending the one-time dollars? But more importantly, do LEAs know, are these expenditures for one-time things or are they for ongoing compensation increases? Okay, so it's this notion of what is our exit strategy if we are using these dollars in an ongoing manner. My hope is that the chief business officials or business managers or whomever the highest level of that business person is in your LEA has their arms around this and is sharing this information with the board as you go into the 24-25 year. I read the headlines that come through, whether it's CSBA or FCMAT, and a lot of boards have taken action for reductions in force, for eliminating positions, and that's a good sign to me. A lot of LEAs use these dollars for ongoing salaries, which is important, right? We want to mitigate the learning loss. But as these dollars are expiring, we need to have an off-ramp. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary, a snapshot of all of those dollars that have been allocated. When you look at the second column, the ESSER 1, 2, and 3, those are the federal stimulus dollars that came out from the 3 federal stimulus packages. The largest one, the ESSER 3, $13.6 billion alone. Keep in mind the annual funding that the state of California provides is $100 billion. So to get an investment of $13.6 billion in 1 year is significant. When we look at some of the dollars that the state has contributed as far as one time, that would be the big ones would be on the right, the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, as well as the Arts and Music Instructional Materials Discretionary Block Grant. Okay, started out at over $11 billion. The governor did pull some of that back to deal with the revenue shortfall, but still a sizable investment for LEAs. Next slide. So just as a reminder, as we're coming up on some of these deadlines, the ESSER $3, by far the largest tranche of one-time dollars, those have to be spent or encumbered by September 30 of 2024. We're only a few months away from that. Again, hopefully LEAs are spending those dollars, but in addition, I think the more important piece is if they are being spent in an ongoing manner, what is that exit strategy? Are those positions being terminated or are they being moved into one of the other funding sources that are out there? Okay, next slide. All right, and then the final piece here, and I just want to spend a couple minutes on this because I know we have a few more slides and probably want to get to some questions. I had mentioned at the onset of this section that if you go all the way to fact-finding, there's criteria in law and government code that a fact-finding panel shall consider. There's 7 on here. It's really 6, the 7th one being anything not considered in items 1 through 6. But this is really, I'd say the most persuasive is about comparability. Okay, as an LEA, how do we compare for wages? So I'm looking at number 4, comparison of wages, hours, conditions of employment. And this is the most important piece of it. It's a comparison with other employees, generally in public school employment in comparable communities. Right, so as an LEA is developing their own comparative list of LEAs, you generally would want to include some of your geographic neighbors, even though there might be disparate communities, maybe not real comparable communities. Those are the employees that we're competing for, right, as far as employee talent. So we can't ignore, but going into fact finding, we might be able to cordon off a more specific set of LEAs that, maybe based on student demographics, unduplicated pupil percent. If we are an elementary school district, we're not going to compare wages and benefits with a high school district because we're not competing for teacher talent with a high school district, right? Different set of criteria to teach over there. Knowing going into that first bargaining session, how do we compare in salaries and benefits in total compensation? Okay, are there other conditions of employment where we are better? Maybe we have smaller class sizes. Perhaps we have additional classified supports in our classrooms, right? Instructional aides, paraprofessionals, things of that nature. There was a school district that we were supporting in fact finding, a little small school district. They provided free childcare to all of their employees for before and after school. Okay, that's a working condition benefit that was unique to that school district that we wanted to make sure that we knew about, but also that our community knew about as we went into fact finding. And then number 5 on here was the CPI. We talked about that early on, the Consumer Price Index. Again, that longitudinal period. This does not say the CPI for November of 2022. Okay, this is CPI overall. Have we maintained the purchasing power of our employees? Having that at our fingertips, and again, communicating that we have that information can help you get through negotiations more quickly. All right, so I think that's it for me. Next slide. All right, so Kristin, do you want to continue on with this section, or is there any questions to address?
Let me check out the questions here. So just a couple clarifications. And by the way, Matt, Patty said, hiring school services to prepare your fact-finding binder is the only way to go. SSC's knowledge base about this process is invaluable. So a little shout out to you guys over there.
Oh, thank you.
And Bianca has seconded that. So
Hi, Bianca.
Anne asked, do the salary increases include step and column increases in your slide?
No, so the salary increases are just the negotiated settlements. So just the percentage increases. Step and column is something that we always want to ensure that we're accounting for when we talk about cost increases, because those happen on the natural. So before the board ever has any conversation around spending new funding, whether from the COLA or from increased number of students, step and column happens on the natural. You know, our advice to CBOs is that when you're calculating step and column, we want to try and capture this notion of attrition, which is if we have let's say we have 10 teachers who retire and we replace those teachers with 10 more junior teachers, there's going to be a cost savings there. That's the concept of attrition. But we certainly want to take credit for the costs associated with step and column.
Okay, and then this question, the public and the union seem to forget the auto increases each year. Are these ever reflected in this type of chart or given consideration during impasse? In other words, even if we didn't give an increase, our staff costs increase automatically.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, step and column is a part of that. Certainly what's happening with the pension systems, post-PEPRA with CalSTRS and CalPERS. CalSTRS has leveled off for now. So for every $1 of certificated salaries that's paid out by an LEA, they're making a 19.1 cent contribution to CalSTRS. On the classified side, payments to CalPERS, for every $1 of classified salaries, I think it's up to 27%. So 27 cents in addition to that is being contributed to CalPERS, and those increases are still happening. That's projected to go over 30% in the next few years. All right. So again, it's management's responsibility to advertise that before we ever get to bargaining, we have these cost increases that are happening on the natural.
Okay, great. So I'm going to move on just in light of the time. We've got about 13 minutes left and quite a bit to cover still. So if you go to the next slide, please, Chair. So we just wanted to talk briefly about communications, both within the negotiations teams, et cetera. We talked to them about that, but more about how to communicate overall to your school community. I just want to note, Troy's going to talk some about communications. He's the communications expert, but I do want to note there are some rules about communicating about negotiations to the broader school community, including to your employees and parents, et cetera. And John's going to talk about the rules a little bit more too when we get into the strategies. But just keep in mind that you can't interfere with employee rights. You have the right to speak, but your speech can't contain threats of reprisal, which is, effectively retaliation or force or promise of a benefit. So you can't send out a communication to all teachers saying, if you pressure your union to agree to this agreement, we'll provide you with X benefit. Nothing like that. But what you can do is send out factual communications about the status of negotiations to keep everybody updated. And just you want to make sure that nothing that you're doing is discouraging employees from participating in their union, or being part of the union, paying dues, or otherwise going along with their representative. So just be careful. And I'll let Troy go on to some more practical thoughts about communication.
Thank you, Kristin. If you could advance the slide, I'll be very brief because I know we're up against it with time and there's still some unanswered questions. That's the flip side of answering the questions as we go along, but we thought it was important to try and tie those questions in to the relevant material when it was being covered. So here are some community engagement basics, and the first point is by far the most important point. For some of you, this may have already passed, but it's never too late to try and catch up. And the basic principle here is that good communications begin before collective bargaining begins. You don't want to just start communicating about the overall national economic picture, the state budget, or where you sit financially on a local level right when the negotiations start. One that seems a little bit tactical and manipulative and may make people respond less positively to your information. But more importantly, there's a lot of context that you have to provide in order for people to view your position in the collective bargaining in the proper light. Because for the most part, the unions, the bargaining units are going to want to keep it very concentrated on what are our demands, what is the pay increase that we're seeking, and why is the district not meeting it, or why is the COE not meeting it if they say that they value teachers and staff. So the obligation, the onus is on you to provide the broader picture of the constraints that you're working in, again, because of the macroeconomic picture, because of the state budget, and because of your past and present financial situation and desire to have a sustainable school district. It takes a long time to download this information. You should be really constantly providing this information on a regular revolving basis, but certainly it should begin well before you're sitting down at the table, and you need to be imprinting your constituents with this information. I pretty much referred to the second bullet point already, but I think it's really important in the post-COVID environment where there is so much coverage of all the relief funds that came into schools, and the state is always putting out press releases. The governor's office is promoting the largest education budget ever. So the casual person who follows the school district, which is most people who are not engaged in the details, is going to say, you've had this huge windfall. Not correct. We all know that. It's been explained earlier in the presentation, but you're going to have to counter that perception. You're already starting from below sea level and you have to climb your way back. And so you really need to be specific about the fact that, yes, we had a few good budgets in a row, but that followed 40 years of underinvestment in California schools. Yes, we got COVID relief funds, but they're expiring this year. And we hired a lot of people to implement these COVID relief funds. We're not necessarily going to be able to keep all of them, and there's a huge cost with that because labor is our biggest cost. You need to talk about declining enrollment. You need to talk about the fact that the legislature is always passing unfunded mandates and not providing enough money to pay for them, which is an issue that CSBA is always addressing with the legislature and the governor. You also need to talk about there's step and column, as we've discussed. There's rising costs. All this factors in. So it's not a lack of respect for teachers. It's the realistic assessment of the environment and what's needed to provide not just for the here and now or the next 2 years, but a district that can be sustained through the long term. On a more emotional messaging communications point, don't get so bogged down in the details that you forget to reaffirm the importance of teacher and classified staff and your desire to take care of them financially and in terms of quality of life environment, workplace environment, as much as possible without endangering the fiscal health of the school district or undermining your ability to implement your plans for schools. Related to that is you need to have a larger vision for your negotiation strategy, a moral framework for the strategy. So talk about your negotiations, not just in terms of dollars and cents and figures, but in why you have to balance the money that goes to staff with the money that are required for the other resources, supports, environments that are integral to student learning. So it's not an either or. The money goes to the teachers and the kids don't get anything. There are so many levers to instruction, learning, and personal development that students need. A huge part of that, a gigantic part of that, are salaries to teachers and staff. But there are also other ways that we need to boost student achievement and create really positive school environments. And you need to be making those points, which you should be able to tie back to your mission, vision, and the investments and priorities that are indicated in your LCAP. Next slide, please. Again, we already talked about this. Be proactive, not reactive to developments in the legislature. There's a constant barrage of news, whether it's CSBA emails or other sources that you have that provide new information to augment your case about this fiscal storm that we're entering in. So be sure to share that whenever you have a chance. And as far as proactive communications, I have to do a little self-promotion here. There's a tool that our research and education policy development created. It's a PowerPoint template. You could take that information presented at board meetings, or just take the text and use it in a newsletter or a variety of other communications vehicles. And what it does is communicate a lot of the information about the constraints that school boards are working under as we go into budget negotiations. If you go to CSBA's budget resources page, it's called The Forecast for Storms, Considerations for LEA Budgeting in an Uncertain Fiscal Climate. It's a nice little toolkit template that you can use to provide these educational opportunities for your stakeholders. Also, when you're communicating with those stakeholders, don't only rely on formal communications, the email, posting to the website, board meetings, etc. There are a lot of opportunities to go out in community, whether it's speaking at churches or synagogues or mosques, whether it's speaking at YMCA or a local community center or any place where you know people are going to be assembled. That helps remove this barrier between the school board, the administration, and your community that you're trying to reach. And most people are never going to go to a board meeting. They're only intermittently going to read your communications. So you need to have a more expansive strategy to reach them. Along those lines, cultivate credible allies and partners to amplify your message. It can't just be school district people who are paid or people who are on the board who are delivering your narrative. If that's the only place people are hearing the message from, they're going to be suspicious. And in many districts, there's a history of suspicion or distrust of the school district because the school district has not always served students well. And so you can amplify your message, be more effective in communicating if you identify community organizations or standout people in the community who can deliver your message. Keep differences behind closed doors. That's obvious. We talked about the importance of a unified message earlier, so I won't go further into that. And then also maintain regular contact with your constituents and local political officials. Most of your bargaining units are going to have robust relationships with the political officials, especially in the Democratic areas which dominate in California. So you need to be providing your version of events, explaining your context and providing your narrative to those people as well so they get the whole story. And next slide, please. We'll close out quickly. You need to find a consistent district spokesperson who has credibility, is well-informed and articulate. This could be your PIO, it could be your superintendent, it could be someone else, but this person needs to be solid, reliable, and constantly informed so they can build trust with the community through the course of the communications. Always try and be non-emotional. You're going to be judged as a public official much more harshly, if you have a reactive stance. Don't get caught in back and forth and try and refer questions on specifics to the official spokesperson. If you feel you're being maligned, which often, if not most of the time you will be, if mistruths circulate, correct those, but do it calmly. You need to be the adult in the room. Don't take it personally. And then stay in communication with the superintendent to make sure you have the latest and you're not behind the ball in terms of information that you need to do your job. Next slide, please. And so we'll conclude with strategies for bargaining in tough economic times.
Okay. So we're going to go through these pretty quickly. Just a reminder that it's more important than ever to stick with your team when you're in tough economic times and at the table and dealing with all these difficult communications and being able to ensure fiscal solvency of the district while also meeting your obligations to bargain in good faith. So your role is to know what to ask from your superintendent and your CBO so that you understand your bargaining position as far as the financials of the district. Going along with what Troy said, make sure you're supporting your chief negotiator and your public facing communications, mainly at board meetings, but any other place where you are discussing anything to do with negotiations. You want to make sure that you are all on the same team, you are holding firm, and nobody is siphoning off information and going a different way. And make sure that your chief negotiator has the appropriate authority to ensure that they are meeting and negotiating in good faith the way that we discussed earlier on in the presentation. Next slide, please. This is going to require some flexibility. You don't want to get too entrenched in a particular position, and be willing to make reasonable adjustments depending on changes to facts or what happens in negotiations and what is being reported to you by your chief negotiator. This is bargaining. This is compromise. This is creativity that you need to be giving your chief negotiator the ability to make creative proposals and try to get to an agreement. This can include non-economic benefits or any other creative solution they can come to, because ultimately you don't want to strike. And impasse and fact-finding may happen. And as we're going to tell you, it's not failure, but if you can avoid it, that is the best thing for the district and for your relationship with the union, and to save you some costs as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to let John take over.
Sure. So I don't think the rules have changed as far as bargaining goes in tough economic times versus great economic times. Some of these things are just absolutes and universal, but or everlasting. But we need to be prepared, principled, and we need to show ourselves as being reasonable. I'm seeing some amazing things that districts are putting together, teams that I'm working with, as far as mastering the things that Matt was talking about, having all the latest budget comps information, data, how it impacts their districts, understanding from principals, assistant principals, other stakeholders, what the contractual weaknesses are, what our contractual strengths are, and actually being mindful of those fact-finding standards that Matt shared with you back on slide 25. They know this stuff. It's not like we're grasping for straws at the first session or the second session, or we're building momentum for the middle of negotiations. We know the facts and we're prepared from the get-go, before bargaining even starts, when we're putting together our initial proposals, and I'm seeing great data and information being shared. The principles to stick with, that's principles, P-R-I-N-C, you know how to spell it. But what I'm talking about is being committed to student success, fiscal responsibility. Those are the things that need to ground us and center us and be the values, the core values that we emphasize when we have negotiations, especially during difficult economic times. And also, we want to be reasonable from beginning to end. The unions are coming in still with proposals, some of them, for proposals of 13% or 15% or whatever the case might be for 24, 25. How is that reasonable? How is that justifiable when we look at the data, whether it's state budget or other things as well? So stay true to preparation, being principled, and staying reasonable. Next. What Troy was talking about is a little different than, I mean, it's relevant. What I'm talking about in this slide is a specific communication strategies to use for negotiations. It's not joint communiques after every bargaining session where the union and the district sit down. It's actually a plan that the district is going to communicate the district team after every session. That team's got to get approval to do that kind of thing. They should get it from the board, because as we said earlier, the board, the team members on the district's bargaining team, they are your agents, board members. They are your representatives. So the team should recommend a plan to you, a communication strategy to you, and get your approval in advance. And really what we're talking about are regular updates to all employees, the public, other stakeholders, whether it's on your website, whether it's emails. We have the right to communicate so long as it's factual. We're not hyperbolic or creating propaganda pieces. We're not being threatening. We're not promising benefits if they do X, Y, or Z. And if we stick to the crucial rule of I am reporting on what happened during negotiations, then that is legal. We want to emphasize our point of view. Good communication pieces are not meeting minutes. That's not what we're talking about here. And there are plenty of examples where I'm working with teams and we are providing really good communication pieces. And ultimately, if you model that kind of structure, you will begin over time to begin to see the union copy and to model or to do what you're modeling and to behave differently in the communications that they put out. Last slide, we'll underscore it again. Don't view impasse as being failure. If you have to go to impasse or you're going to impasse, realize that sometimes that forum sparks new ideas. It sparks new energy. It sparks new motivation to get it done. And somehow there's a change between where you were when you were dealing directly between the parties to where you are when you have the help of a mediator. The mediator can be helpful. Some are better than others, but ultimately the parties have to help themselves in mediation and come in with a plan as to what they think they can do, where they might be able to move or come up with a different idea to get it done. But the longer the impasse process, as longer we participate in that, impasse mediation, fact-finding. Think of that slide that Kristin showed us in the beginning, all the different parts of the impasse mediation or the impasse procedure. The longer that continues, the more difficult it becomes to settle. So be mindful, have a strategy, and I think we're going to get through these times, and I think we're going to see districts step up in a big, high-quality way as we head into new rounds for bargaining.
Okay, so that's it for the slides. We are a little bit over time. We can stay and answer questions if folks would like us to. So we'll start to take some questions. Just a couple quick things. Troy, can you repeat where to find the template that you mentioned on the budget
Absolutely.
presentation?
Probably the easiest way to find it is just typing CSBA or California School Boards Association budget resources into Google or whatever search engine you use, and the link will come up. You can also find it through a manual search if you go to the homepage of CSBA's website. I believe it's under, yes, Governance and Policy Resources is a tab, and beneath that, there's a link to the budget resources page. So again, type in CSBA budget resources. That's probably the easiest way to get there. And if you go down to the resources, it's titled Forecast for Storms, Considerations for LEA Budgeting in Uncertain Financial Times.
Okay, thanks.
So,
I just want to, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kristin.
I just wanted to note something that someone had said that I think is a good comment, that COLA is a misnomer, and provided the education code citation for what is used to determine the COLA is 42238.02. This is not the same as changes in the cost of living encountered by employees of an LEA. We try to steer away from an argument that the state COLA represents an appropriate cost of living adjustment for employees. I just thought that was a really good point. We see that a lot, and just a reminder to educate on those various kind of complex things. So thanks, Richard, for that. Go ahead, Troy.
Yeah, so let's move to the questions. We won't be able to get to all of these. There's 16 open questions in the queue. We did try to answer as we went along, and I think we've touched on most of the major topics, but we'll try and pick up a few here. This is sort of the speed round of the webinar. The first question, just taking them in chronological order of when they were received. I am concerned about the financial solvency of my school district. Are there resources or guidance for a board member who sees their superintendent spending and creating new ongoing positions? So to reframe the question, I guess it's about what is recommended for a board member who maybe is approaching difficult collective bargainings, but also sees what they regard as questionable or excess spending at the district level. How do you reconcile those two and maybe modify the situation? Anyone can jump in.
I think the superintendent is your employee. That's the board's only employee. And to address what you see as concerns that you have about their superintendent's actions as they operate the rest of the district is through their evaluation process. That is really the place where you address those kind of issues.
And I would tack on to that, you know, a board member is only as influential or powerful as the other board members.
Yeah.
So if you're the only one with that concern, I would probably pause and think about why you're the only one. But certainly question your other board members as well to see if they have the concern. And if you get the majority of the board, then that's where the power lies, not just in the single board member.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's take the next one.
Yes. Any advice when our union's demands and bargaining are completely devoid of any connection to reality? Our overall budget is about $500 million. The union demands total approximately $179 million. And we are facing $30 million in budget cuts before settling the contract. They have refused our offers to meet with social services and a rep from CTA to dive into our budget to come to a common understanding. If it feels hopeless, is this bargaining in good faith on their part?
Probably not, but publicize that. If you have a communication strategy and they're being completely unreasonable, why wouldn't we share that with the public and all your employees and see if the rank and file, the members of the association, can pressure their leaders to do a better job at the table? But why anyone would refuse to meet with you, Matt, I don't understand.
All right, that's pretty straightforward. We'll move on to the next question. Why doesn't the board have the role to set strategy? Because they have the responsibility to represent the long-term interests of the community, while the current employee, e.g. superintendent, has a shorter timeline and less expansive perspective on the effect of the negotiations, e.g. setting up expectations for what employees will be able to achieve at the next negotiation. So I guess the question is, why doesn't the board take a stronger role in setting the strategy? Because in general, board members are in their place longer than the superintendent.
Yeah, and I think that question probably derived from what I was saying earlier. You know, it depends what you call strategy. I call it parameters. I call it what the goals, the hopes are for the board and what they're trying to achieve. I definitely want the team and me to hear that directly from the board or through the superintendent. But strategy also has to be, it changes quite, it's very malleable, and things need to be done not on the fly, but during the session. And we don't have the ability in bargaining because the board is delegating certain authority and responsibility to the team. We don't have the ability to just keep going back after every exchange of proposals. So we need to know up front what the board's expectations, objectives are. And then I think it's that team that are the boots on the ground that needs to find the way to make that happen. And I think that's where a lot of the strategic considerations come to play.
And I think, you know, we're talking about negotiations right now, but you have a superintendent, you have a cabinet, you have teachers and classified employees to implement the strategy, right? The board, if we talk about instruction, the board does not teach the curriculum. The board does not determine what professional development is needed. The board hears the recommendations from the staff about a textbook adoption and they approve the purchase. And then it's up to the staff to implement and strategize how they're going to implement. We take that because they're the experts, right? Take that same analogy and apply it to the negotiations. You have the staff for the reason.
Yeah.
Great. I just want to say that one of my colleagues, Alicia Kirby, a writer here at CSBA, you read her stuff if you follow our publication. She put a link in the questions near the bottom of the questions that you can copy or click on the link to go directly to that budget resources template we were talking about. But as for the next question, we are seeing filing of unfair labor practices by the union used as a strategy to pressure the district to settle. I.e., if you give us what we're asking for in negotiations, we'll drop these unfair labor claims. So what do we think about that?
So I think a lot of things that associations do are intended to put pressure on you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't do. Okay. And if there is an unfair, you take each unfair and you assess, is it reasonable? Is there merit to it? And you deal with that in isolation, and then you negotiate on a parallel track. That would be my recommendation.
Okay. And the next question, also directed specifically for Matt, can you discuss basic aid a bit too? I mean, what are the differences, I guess, for collective bargaining from a basic aid context?
Yeah, I think, the big distinction between a basic aid or a community funded district, and for those board members who don't understand the distinction, about 90% of districts in the state are funded based off of students showing up each and every day. So the COLA matters, attendance matters. There's about 10% of school districts who collect sufficient property taxes and have excess property taxes that they collect locally, that it's actually a funding level higher than what they would get based off students showing up each and every day. And so they get to keep all those property taxes. So those are called basic aid or community funded districts. I think the distinction there, Bianca, is that we want to make sure our community understands that COLA does not impact our growth in funding, that our growth in funding is based off of growth in secured property taxes and really hammering that home. While there are some things the state provides that do impact the district as far as funding, they're very insignificant in the grand scheme compared to the amount of property taxes that are collected. So the focus should be on property taxes.
Thank you for making that distinction. The next question asks whether these comparisons take into account comparable funding levels. We are funded at only about 75% of the state average per ADA and only about 73% of the county average per ADA. Obviously, it's impossible for us to keep up with what other districts are offering when we are chronically and significantly underfunded.
And that's part of our story. I mean, we need to bring out those distinctions between, a really high funded basic aid or community funded district versus, another district that does not receive that kind of state support. And that's part of our story when we were talking about the importance of knowing the comps. That's why District A is really a true comp when compared to our district, and District B is not a good comp or a true comp when it comes to considering apples to apples.
And I think that's also part of the communication strategy when we talked about proactive communications. What percentage of your constituents know that? I'm sure it's a tiny percentage. Your goal is to up the percentage of people who understand that context, that constraint that you're working under.
I'll just add, Troy, that obviously compensation and particular salary is a big driving point and focal point, as it should be. But for many employees, it is not the main one, or certainly the only one. Some employees might be motivated by other benefits. Others might be interested in, the quality of facilities. Others might be interested in, how close the community is for them in terms of whether they live. So obviously that doesn't sort of lessen the import of salary, but it may be that through sort of that creative process I was talking about before, the conversation can also include other benefits or value and ways to augment those. If you have a district that is able to pass a bond and you have vacant land, right? There's conversations about employee housing. I mean, there's other things that you can look at that might not necessarily be tied directly to compensation, particularly in a situation where you are, lower on average in terms of revenue generated compared with, neighboring districts.
Very, very good point. The discussion is broader than just compensation, and it's important to include that into your communications and your negotiation strategy as well. The next question asks, are teachers permitted to solicit or even offer students extra credit in their classes for speaking on their behalf at board meetings?
No.
There's really nothing more to say than that.
Yeah, and I agree with John. That is
It's unprofessional conduct 44938.
Okay, there's even ed code to document it if you question. So that's in Gamut, or you could contact CSBA or DWK and we'll reinforce.
Just to 100% John's right. And pick your battles. And if it's one teacher with one student versus everyone has been going on for years, because as soon as you go after anyone in negotiations, it becomes personal. whether they're attacking a board member or you're attacking a teacher or a union leader or a negotiator. And so as a board member, if you go really hard on the fact that one teacher is telling their students to come to board meetings and criticize you, and that's the only one doing it, nobody else is doing it, then just to be thoughtful about what going after them as a board member would do to the conversation.
Right.
And not saying don't do it, not saying it makes it illegal, but just this whole thing, you pick your battles and be strategic.
Yeah, and that's a personnel matter. I don't see board member involvement on that issue. I see it coming from the assistant sup of HR in conjunction with the principal.
So moving on to the next question, are there any issues with a union leader sharing their perception or understanding of the current negotiation with the board in an email? Parenthetical here says there's distrust that the district leadership is sharing the full information.
Yeah, we can't prevent it, but I hope that the answer from the board member would be, thank you very much for sharing that information. I passed it on to our bargaining team, so that they're aware of it as well. And, we have full confidence that our team will address these issues that you've raised.
In addition to that, there's a lot of districts will have joint communications. So if I'm a board member and I'm getting these one-offs from the union leadership, I would go through my superintendent and say, is there a way that our bargaining team and the association bargaining team, presidents or lead negotiators can come up with a joint communication that they both review, and then they send it our way, so that it would kind of eliminate this lack of trust that's out there because they're both signing off on the message.
Yeah. Big thumbs up to the joint communications. That's huge, and that just sort of establishes trust. I will say that the middle of negotiations is not the time to resolve mistrust that the board has with its negotiators. So if you don't feel that your superintendent or your lead negotiator is appropriately sharing information with you, it is not in the midst of negotiations when things are super tense to have that conversation. It is after those are resolved, and then through whether it's superintendent evaluation or other processes, you can understand, okay, why did I as a board member not feel comfortable? Or I got this email from the union leader saying that you didn't, disclose this information or share this with the board or, what have you. And I'm concerned about that. And I'd like to understand what happened. I mean, you can have your debrief after the fact. And if you need to change personnel at that point, have those conversations. But in the midst of bargaining, when everybody is super tense and priorities are like, everything just seems so important, it's going to cause a lot more, it is likely to cause a lot more disruption than to solve it.
So the next question is, what training does CSBA offer where we can learn what we should be asking? So our flagship training offering is the Masters in Governance, better known as our MIG program, has 5 different modules, which cover sort of the gamut of issues that board members need to be aware of. And that's a great place to start. We also have special trainings for new board member orientation, where some of this will be orientation for new trustees, an institute for new board members that covers some of this, as well as periodic trainings with a specific focus on finance. So that's certainly something that it's a growth area for us. But I would say the starting point would be Masters in Governance. And you can always contact people here at CSBA with questions. We also have our legal services offering, which provides direct legal services as well, and they can assist you. And of course, obviously, DWK School Services are experts in this area, and they can certainly be contacted as well for information. CSBA's Masters in Governance main message is that impasse is a failure of the district and board. I would say that's a little reductive. I mean, ideally, an impasse is a failure, but that doesn't mean that both parties are equally complicit. Every situation is going to be different, and I think if you're assigning responsibility, it's going to require an independent analysis of the specific situations in that LEA. And if anybody has something to add, please jump in.
Well, just to push back on that a little bit, I don't know, I think Matt said this earlier, that impasse is necessarily a failure. each party has only so much it can go, right? The board has its financial considerations and other operational pieces. The, labor has to reflect the needs of its members. And it may be that whether because the interests are so far apart or the relationship is so challenged that the normal process of negotiations does not allow the parties to find that commonality on how to move forward. And so it is the impasse process that allows you to figure that out. It's like, it's asking for help or support is not a sign of weakness. That is true whether you're a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, a board member, or negotiations. And so I understand that some might want to paint it that way to assert, to push and leverage it more, but fundamentally, it may be that is the piece that allows you to get to commonality and move forward.
And I'll tack on it. That's a great messaging point, Josh. Thank you for that. Our firm teaches the finance module of Masters in Governance, module 3, that has a collective bargaining component in it. And I know that we have never said that it's a failure to go to impasse. What I will say is that if you're trying to get to impasse as quickly as possible and foregoing that opportunity for at the table negotiations, where the trust is really built, where the information can be shared, where you can build a collaborative environment. If you're basically, as a board, saying, well, we don't want to deal with him, let's just bring in someone from the outside to solve our problems, that is a failure. Okay. But going to impasse, asking for help because both parties brought forth their best effort and they just weren't able to get across the finish line, that should not be viewed as a failure.
Yep. Thank you for providing that important nuance and for sharing that detail about module 3 of our Masters in Governance training.
And just one other thing, remember what John said, that impasse, the process, mediation, fact-finding can actually spark new ideas, help come to some other resolution that no one had thought of before. So it can actually be a positive.
Yeah, I do think the public, in the spirit of Ann's question, will view it as a negative. So again, it's up to you as communicators or the people your district employees as communicators to say that we are not on the road to disaster merely because we're headed to impasse. Certainly things aren't going as well as we hope, but this is another opportunity to bring in additional expertise and hopefully reach an amicable resolution in the end. Because certainly the public perception when they hear impasse will be that, okay, the next thing is a strike, and that's not necessarily the case. We have a request. I don't know, Che, you're running the slides, if it's possible to go back and find that slide comparing CPI and COLA. I'm not sure what number that was in the deck.
Yeah, and remember, everyone will get the slide deck and the recording on Friday. It would have been.
Yeah, I think we passed it.
You went too far. It would have been in that middle section.
But yes, to reiterate, like we said at the outset, we will send out an email with a link to this entire recording, as well as the PowerPoint deck you're viewing now by Friday at the latest.
Yeah, there it is.
But I think the key message that has really been lifted up during this conversation is that people think COLA is equivalent to the increase in all their living expenses. If gas went up 7% or groceries went up 9% or whatever it was, that the COLA is going to be 7 or 9% to reflect that. And that's not at all the case. I think that's a big source of confusion. So this is really a communications opportunity that I'm going to think about more is how do we do a better job of teasing apart the public perception of COLA from what it actually is in the state budget. So thank you to those who raise that issue. And the last question of the day, do you have advice for basic aid districts where there is so much unpredictability in the budget and therefore negotiations have more unknowns?
Slow down. And maybe you can't do a 3-year agreement. Maybe you have to be a little more cautious. And maybe you have to do a look back or some contingency type language, depending on things you're waiting for relative to assessed values and everything else. So you got to be patient. It would be great to have a 3-year closed contract, but maybe sometimes you got to slow it down a bit. But it all depends. Some, you know, and some community funded districts will want to have a closed contract and then have those reopeners for salary and benefits the 2nd and 3rd year. But, you know, think through the timing of what you're agreeing to in advance.
Great. Thank you everyone for participating today. Che, if you could just fast forward to the contact slide you were on before, give people one last chance to, look at the contact information, but it was up there for a long time. So if you
You'll
didn't
get it
by
on
now,
Friday.
you can just email us csba@csba.org and we'll direct you to the right person.
Yeah,
So
and I just want to give a huge thank you to John and Matt for joining us today. That was really great, useful information. We really appreciate it. Everybody reach out to them for your legal and finance needs. They're both really great and have a lot of incredible experience and knowledge in this area. So thank you so much to both for your participation today. It was really great to have you.
Well, thanks to you, Kristin, and everyone on the panel. Really enjoyed it, and great questions from the crowd. Really good questions.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
thanks for those of you who stuck around this long. That was really awesome.
yeah, we went into extra time. There were a lot of penalties and injury stoppage, but we got it all in there.
I'll start
right,
telling
everyone.
my life story right now.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you
Thanks,
soon.
everybody.
Bye.